I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Anna F. Peppard, whose work I've been following for years and who I've already had the pleasure of hearing speak on several other occasions at conferences. Anna is a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Communication, Popular Culture and Film at Brock University in Canada. She has published widely on representations of race, gender, and sexuality within a variety of popular media genres and forms, including action-adventure television, superhero comics, professional wrestling, and sports culture. She's the editor of the anthology Supersex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero, which is out from the University of Texas Press next month, and also co-hosts the podcast Three-Panel Contrast. Anna's talk today is entitled Mutant Romance Tales, The Pleasure and Power of Supersex. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much for having me. I guess we're ready to get started. Should I share? So I think I should just be I should be exactly 40 minutes, so we should still have time for questions at the end. Does that look okay on your end?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to get started. So I am going to do a very just really mild content warning that there is some nudity in this presentation. Nothing that should be shocking or anything like that. There's no trigger warning content. There's nothing sexual violence. But just as I know that we don't all have the privilege of private professional spaces these days, I just thought I would mention it. I think it's the kind of images that are far more likely to make you smile than anything else. It's a pretty upbeat talk, but I did just want to mention it. But without further ado, we'll get started. As comic scholars, we know a thing or two about the power of images. This talk is essentially going to be about that, with a specific focus on the power of images of sexy comic book superheroes appearing largely in mainstream contexts, not exclusively, but largely. I'm going to start this discussion with an image that I've thought about and stared at a lot over the years. It's a very silly image, but meaningful to me despite that, or in a way because of that. So here we go. So this is Nightcrawler of the X-Men, giving himself as a Christmas gift to his girlfriend, a sorceress and sometime flight attendant named Amanda Sefton. This scene appears in Uncanny X-Men number 168, originally published in 1983. It's written by Chris Claremont and penciled by Paul Smith. So there's a lot going on in this image. First of all, in case you're not aware, this image is a reference to this one of Burt Reynolds from a 1972 issue of Cosmopolitan. This image appeared in Cosmo at the behest of editor Helen Gurley Brown, an icon of the sexual revolution who authored the 60s bestseller Sex and the Single Girl. This Burt Reynolds image became almost instantly infamous. It's been credited with inspiring the creation of Playgirl magazine the following year, and it's been replicated and parodied many, many times. Some of you might remember it being referenced in the marketing for the first Deadpool film. But as interesting as this Deadpool image is, I want to focus on the significance of this much earlier Nightcrawler one. The Nightcrawler and Burt Reynolds images do similar things. Regardless of your mileage on the attractiveness of either of these real or imaginary men, these images make the male body accessible in ways that were very unusual in the 1970s and 80s and remain atypical now. With notable exceptions like Calvin Klein underwear ads, which are known for their gender-bending provocativeness, when male bodies are displayed in modern Western culture, they tend to be displayed in contexts of action, wherein they function more as ego ideals than erotic objects. In both of these images, however, the male body is deliberately offered up as a consumable object. This is indicated by the passivity of the pose and by the playfulness of the men's expressions, which welcome interested gazes and suggest joy in being consumed. The Nightcrawler image is both more and less provocative than the Reynolds image. On the one hand, the character is not naked. He's also not real. He's a drawing, not a person. On the other hand, it reminds us of how close superheroes in skin-tight spandex always are to being naked. The Nightcrawler image also uses the imaginative freedom of cartooning to double down on the theme of consumption. The most potent phallic symbols in the scene are also liquid consumables. The champagne bottle and Nightcrawler's prehensile tail holding a glass of champagne, both of which are angled toward Amanda and toward us, the reader, since we're sharing Amanda's perspective in this scene. This is the full page. The replication of Nightcrawler in a toy of himself, which potentially functions as a third phallic symbol, and the visual comparison between Nightcrawler and the toy and the large present at the right of the frame ties a nice bow around everything, which is given an additional final flourish by Amanda's exclamation of "yum," advertising her clear intention to make good on this invitation to consumption. In all this colorful description, I haven't yet touched on perhaps the most important difference between this image and the Reynolds one, which is that Nightcrawler isn't straightforwardly human. He's a mutant, and specifically a mutant marked by monstrousness. He has pointed ears, fangs, blue fur, a forked tail, glowing yellow eyes, three-fingered hands and feet. Your standard demon package, very similar to the ones that menace so many maidens in medieval and Renaissance art. Nightcrawler's monstrousness makes this image a send-up of the Reynolds centerfold. It's funny because he's so obviously not Burt Reynolds. And yet the scene isn't just being played for laughs. Nightcrawler has the same lean muscles as Reynolds. He is, in other words, constructed as attractive in a similar way, and is clearly meant to be viewed as attractive. In fact, the next issue makes good on the promise of unwrapping him by including several scenes in which he's suggestively naked in appealing contexts of romance and action, in a hot tub with Amanda and teleporting around the city to save a friend who picked the worst possible moment to get kidnapped. In this image, Nightcrawler is a sexy monster, and that matters. As any era's vampire stories show us, sexy monsters enable monstrous desires. In Western culture, anything that isn't the stereotypical desires of straight, white, able-bodied men has often been characterized as monstrous. Other desires have been persecuted, pathologized, or simply ignored by those wielding the most cultural capital. And yet, here's this image of a sexy demon mutant superhero we're meant to consume, happily and without guilt. More remarkable still, this image exists within a genre and context that's not known for catering to a diversity of gazes, that is instead known for its heavy investment in the stereotypical male gaze, wherein, to paraphrase Laura Mulvey, women convey to-be-looked-atedness, while men cannot bear the burden of sexual objectification, because men are reluctant to gaze at their exhibitionist like. So, how do we explain this image? We can explain it by re-examining what we think we know about how gender, sex, and sexuality work within the superhero genre, by undressing underexplored facets of how superheroes and their fantastic, excessive, and often monstrous bodies function as subjects and objects of desire. When we do that, we can see that this image is less of an exception than it might at first appear, and not just because Nightcrawler is a character who tends to welcome diverse gazes a little bit more than others. For all its obviousness, including an obvious privileging of certain gender and sexual norms, the superhero genre is underpinned by intense contradictions that are arguably at their most intense when we consider the genre's relationship with sexuality. Sexuality highlights the ways the superhero genre enables fantasies that are at once obvious and elusive, subversive and conservative. By wearing their underwear on the outside and proudly displaying their exaggeratedly hard and sensuous curves inside revealing skin-tight costumes, virtually all of the most famous superheroes openly invite erotic possibilities. Most of the time, these possibilities are supplemented into violence and fantastic metaphors. While superheroes routinely swell and shrivel, shoot gooey projectiles, and become dramatically entwined with other flamboyantly or scantily clad bodies. When these bodies get banged up and laid out, it tends to be in a fight rather than the bedroom, and the underwear tends to stay on. Yet to the extent that superhero stories always center around fantastic bodies whose incarnated exaggerations and embellishments are explicitly designed to excite and inspire, their erotic potential is inherent and inescapable. Superhero sexuality is flagrantly present even when it's officially absent. Most superheroes are less obviously monstrous than Nightcrawler, and yet to the extent that it is so contradictory, superhero sexuality, or supersex, is always a bit monstrous. It's always hiding under a trench coat or business suit, in a closet, a phone booth, a cave, or a repurposed Victorian mansion in Westchester, yet not hiding, because the convention of hiding and transforming into a different, better self clad in flamboyant spandex is so thoroughly baked into this genre. The disguises are always flimsy for us, the readers, who know all these average Joes and Janes are really superheroes. Laura K. Davies and Christina Santos argue that the unnaturalness of monsters is usually the result of transgressing or incorporating parts of a supposedly natural binary, such as alive/dead or human/animal. Because monsters threaten the natural order, they also threaten the cultural order. Monsters threaten the unity of the body and challenge the prevailing mind-body dualism that pits the so-called rational mind against the so-called chaotic body. The original theoretical framework of psychoanalysis reflects this dualism. human cognitive development as a fall into difference and associating normal psychology with a well-ordered, that is, intellectually rationalized body. In such a body, writes Rosie Braidotti, quote, organs and functions, desired and proper objects, are joined in socially acceptable assemblages. Despite enduring assumptions that superheroes always uncomplicatedly communicate cultural ideals, superheroes are not proper objects, not socially acceptable assemblages. The more they exaggerate gender and sexual norms, the more monstrous superheroes often become. This is often dismissed as evidence of the unintelligence or immaturity of superhero fans. The presumption is superhero fans are too immature to see this monstrousness, to see these contradictions, which are read as a kind of unconscious hysteria, a desperate attempt to reconfirm gender and sexual norms through exaggerations that only accidentally become subversive. And sometimes this is true. Yet it's worth noting that comics, a supposedly unnatural combination of text and images, are not acceptable assemblages either. And though superheroes are currently far more popular in mediums other than comics, comics gave birth to superheroes, and at least in the American context, superheroes helped give birth to comic books. There's something especially powerful and especially dangerous about supersex in its comic book form, about looking at men whose power is drawn to beauty and women whose beauty is drawn to power, as well as characters drawn above and beyond many traditional constraints of gender. If comics are transformatively seductive and even inherently queer, then so are superhero comics. This means superhero comics are anything but simple or obvious. They're complicated and multi-layered, just like superhero readers and just like superhero sexuality. For the rest of my time today, I'm going to talk you through some of these transformative seductions, looking at why they matter and how they can in turn transform our understandings of sexuality, superheroes, and even comics themselves. As I'm sure most of us are aware, Scott McCloud characterizes comics as a particularly interactive medium in which readers must actively participate in filling in the gaps both between images and within them, what McCloud calls closure, wherein every act committed to paper by the comics artist is abetted and aided by a silent accomplice, an equal partner in crime known as the reader. In addition, McCloud's concept of amplification through simplification involves projecting ourselves into simplified figures who encourage such projection through their simplification. To the extent that amplification through simplification involves generating empathy and identification by exaggerating some features of reality and simplifying others, and to the extent that cartoons, being drawings, cannot possess their own agency, when we read comics, objectification goes hand in hand with identification. Cartoons that employ amplification through simplification fundamentally create or recreate reality, and as such, allow us to possess it differently than we can in other mediums. Comics reflect cultural realities, but they also inherently present thoroughly subjective views of reality. To paraphrase Derek Scott and Ramsey Fawaz, in comics, anything that can be imagined can be drawn, and anything that can be drawn can be believed. Comics break down subjective realities into accessible, graspable, digestible forms. Making comics is an act of intense creation and possession, and so is reading them. We can see this possessive intimacy of comic books emphasized in anti-comics journalism from the 1950s, like this piece from the show Confidential File. In this program, children hide comics in the woods, shiver while they read them, and are inspired by comics to enact violent, sadomasochistic rituals. This quite obviously links comics to pornography and other unrespectable body genres like horror and melodrama. Indeed, comics have often been openly compared to pornography, specifically pornography for children, or at the very least, they've been called a form of junk food, a sensual treat that delights the body but rots the mind. The particular intimacy of comic book superheroes was also key to the place of supersex within this moral panic of the 1950s. Just as I'm sure most of you are aware of McCloud, I'm sure most of you are aware of psychiatrist Frederick Wortham's extremely influential 1954 bestseller, Seduction of the Innocent. And at least some of you are probably aware of one of the most famous, or perhaps infamous, quotes from this book concerning Batman and Robin. Wortham describes Batman and Robin as, quote, a wish dream of two homosexuals living together that helps to fixate homoerotic tendencies. According to Wortham, quote, only someone ignorant of the fundamentals of psychiatry and the psychopathology of sex can fail to realize a subtle atmosphere of homoeroticism which pervades the adventures of the mature Batman and his young friend Robin. Wortham interpreted female superheroes such as Wonder Woman in the original Black Cat as similarly, oppositely deviant. Where Batman is anti-feminine, Wortham wrote, the attractive Wonder Woman and her counterparts are definitely anti-masculine. As with Batman, Wonder Woman linked this gender deviance to homosexuality, writing, quote, Wonder Woman's followers are the holiday girls, i.e. the holiday girls, the gay party girls, the gay girls. Besides the problematic essentialism of equating gender with sex and sexuality, Wortham's readings on their own totally outrageous. As Scott and Fawaz argue, comics possess an almost unique ability to indulge in, quote, hyperbolic camp visuality or the metamorphosing of human bodies into forms that call into question traditional gender norms. But where Scott and Fawaz celebrate this ability, Wortham condemns it by sensationalistically and speciously linking it to violence and death. Wortham moves quickly from a description of Robin as, quote, a handsome boy, usually shown in his uniform with bare legs, who often poses with his legs spread, his genital region discreetly evident, to describing a 13-year-old Batman fan on 3 years probation for an incident in which he and a companion had forced a boy of 8, threatening him with a knife to undress and carry out sexual practices with them. The sadomasochistic ritual in the Confidential File film is likely inspired by this story. Wortham states the consequences of reading Wonder Woman comics even more baldly. For boys, writes Wortham, Wonder Woman is a frightening image. For girls, she is a morbid ideal. The moral panic surrounding comic books didn't originate with Wortham, nor were superheroes or their sexuality the only target of his ire. Yet it's notable that the sexual possibilities of superhero comics are central to Wortham's condemnation of them. Wortham's critiques also remain notable because Seduction of the Innocent is almost certainly the most influential book ever published about either superheroes or American comics. This will be a familiar story to comic scholars like yourselves, but it bears repeating. 2 months after the release of Seduction of the Innocent, Wortham was the star witness in a televised and much publicized United States Senate subcommittee investigation into the supposed links between comic books and juvenile delinquency. A few months after that, the American comic book industry saved itself from the threat of government regulation by creating an industry-run censorship program called the Comics Code Authority. From 1954 until a major revision in 1989, the code prohibited American comic book publishers from depicting nudity in any form, illicit sex relations, and a loosely defined and potentially vast array of sexual abnormalities and perversions. For most of the code's history, same-sex desire was one such perversion. Tellingly, the code attempted to regulate both sexuality and fantasy. Until 1989, the code targeted sexual abnormalities alongside lurid, unsavory, suggestive, and salacious illustration of all kinds. The 1989 revision of the code eliminated this language and finally included homosexuals alongside the CIA and FBI on a list of, quote, recognizable national, social, political, cultural, ethnic, and racial groups that must be portrayed in a positive light. Yet even this comparably liberal revision continued to indicate specific, if flexibly enforced, limits on sexual representation of fantasy. In addition to maintaining total bans on the depiction of primary human sexual characteristics and graphic sexual activity, the '89 code reveals a continued wariness regarding comic book superheroes' potential for sexual deviance. Under the 1989 code, quote, costumes will be considered to be acceptable if they fall within the scope of contemporary styles and fashions. In other words, comics must maintain a degree of realism and avoid a total embrace of fantasy. The 1989 code also stipulates, quote, heroes should be role models and should reflect the prevailing social attitudes. In other words, superheroes may have gay acquaintances, but should not ideally be gay themselves. Northstar, a French-Canadian superhero within the Marvel Comics universe who came out in 1992, was one of the few openly LGBTQ superheroes in the so-called Big Two superhero universes until well into the 21st century. Yet in any era and under every version of the code, the deviant potential of supersex has proved resistant to erasure. Before the code, Batman and Robin had slept side by side in matching twin beds in between clandestine outings in which they donned tights and capes to knock boots with the Joker, a man with the physique of an androgyny, the style of a Victorian dandy, and a literally killer brand of ruby red lipstick. After the code, they were joined in both their crime-fighting activities and, on occasion, their mansion by Batwoman and Batgirl, whose curves and costumes would not have been out of place in contemporary fetish art, yet whose affections Batman and Robin routinely spurn in their superhero identities and court in their civilian ones. There was also a metaphorical child in the mischievous imp Batmite and even a dog, Ace the Bat-Hound. Yet if these comics depicted a family, it was a decidedly non-traditional one, including aliens and super-intelligent animals wearing domino masks, as well as women who, despite the sexism informing their portrayal, can't reasonably be described as conforming to 1950s ideals of domesticity. In the Bat family of the 50s and 60s, virtually everyone has a cave or closet to hide an alternate identity that justifies their resistance to the yoke of heteronormativity. Though it took 50 years, Batwoman at least did eventually come out. But despite growing acceptance of more sexual diversity within the superhero genre, the mainstream embrace of sexuality as a meaningful aspect of superheroic identity remains decidedly tentative. Two recent controversies demonstrate the degree to which both producers and consumers continue to perceive superhero sexuality as being at once taboo and an open secret, requiring but also consistently resisting strong-handed management. The first controversy I want to talk about concerns Wonder Woman. On October 21st, 2016, the world's most famous female superhero was appointed an honorary UN ambassador for women and girls. This announcement was accompanied by splashy advertising depicting the Amazon princess clothed in her usual gold and red bustier, accessorized with a shield, demure cape, and the slogan, "Think of all the wonder we can do. Stand up for the empowerment of women and girls everywhere." There was also a well-publicized induction ceremony attended by Linda Carter, star of the 1970s Wonder Woman television show, and current big-screen Wonder Woman Gal Gadot. The objective of the campaign, according to UN spokesperson Jeffrey Brez, was to use Wonder Woman to draw attention to UN Sustainable Goal number 5, which seeks to achieve gender equality and empower all girls and women by 2030. Within days of the announcement, a petition from concerned United Nations staff members was formed to have Wonder Woman stripped of her honorary title. According to the petition, although the original creators may have intended Wonder Woman to represent a strong and independent warrior woman with a feminist message, the reality is that the character's current iteration is that of a large-breasted white woman of impossible proportions, scantily clad in a shimmery, thigh-bearing bodysuit with an American flag motif and knee-high boots, the epitome of a pin-up girl. Bolstered by this petition and the considerable publicity it generated, Wonder Woman's induction ceremony was met with physical protests. 2 months later, she lost her ambassadorship. Brez denied the petition and protests impacted the decision to end the Wonder Woman campaign. One can assume, however, that his office was at the very least unhappy the petition attracted more than 44,000 supporters and generated as much media attention as the campaign itself. Certainly, many of the petition's complaints are valid. Wonder Woman is quite obviously a nationalist symbol as well as a potentially colonialist and even white supremacist one. She has also been throughout her history a thoroughly problematic feminist. Yet rejecting Wonder Woman as a symbol of empowerment on the basis of her being scantily clad and possessing large breasts remains problematic. These criticisms can be seen as defining certain types of female bodies and forms of sexual expression as incompatible with heroism. Significantly, opposing views of Wonder Woman's appropriateness as an ambassador for gender equality specifically highlighted both the fraught history and liberating potential of her sexuality. 14-year-old Tara Peterson's competing petition to reinstate Wonder Woman's honorary title functions as a case in point. In her petition, Peterson writes, "No matter how she is dressed or how she looks, Wonder Woman's message of peace, justice, and gender equality has always remained. She is a queer woman and superhero who should not be judged, nor should anyone, based on what she chooses to wear or how she looks. She's sexy and confident. By no means does that mean she isn't a fantastic role model for girls and boys everywhere." This petition attracted 3,604 supporters before it was closed, something of a drop in the ocean compared to the anti-Wonder Woman petition, but still a strong indicator that the meaning of Wonder Woman's sexuality and heroism remain very much up for debate. Where a group of multinational adult UN employees can see a misogynistic pinup, a 14-year-old American girl can see a queer icon. The second controversy I want to highlight concerns our old friend Batman, and specifically a certain part of his anatomy. On September 19, 2018, Batman Damned number 1 by Brian Azzarello with art by Lee Bermejo went on sale, the first of several scheduled releases within DC's newly minted Black Label imprint. According to the company's website, Black Label, quote, "will be DC's home for classy, collectible superhero stories aimed at mature readers looking to be challenged and surprised as they're entertained, with an eye for the unique and remarkable." In words less inflected with marketing spin, Black Label is DC's mature readers imprint, so for 18-plus readers. Batman Damned number 1 demonstrated this maturity by including the first on-panel appearance of the Dark Knight's penis. The context of this scene is not sexual, or at least not explicitly so. Batman's penis is clearly but incidentally visible in one panel of a page when Bruce Wayne strips naked so that his computer can scan him for knife wounds. Moreover, the comic's violence, the issue concludes with a splash page presenting a corpse mutilated and crucified by the Joker, did not attract any significant criticism. Yet shortly after the release of Batman Damned number 1, every major pop and geek culture outlet ran something about the revelation of Batman's penis. Mainstream outlets such as Vice and The Guardian also picked up the story, as did talk shows such as Late Night with Seth Meyers. Given that we exist in what many scholars have described as a pornified culture, in which pictures of virtually any sex act imaginable are only a click away, and, as Linda Williams puts it, the formerly obscene has become on-scene, the uproar over a single, not overtly sexual image of Batman's penis does an especially good job of demonstrating the power and danger bound up in superhero sexuality. Some reactions to the penis were condemnatory, and most were decidedly juvenile. Myers quipped, "I'm glad his mother's not alive to see this." Yet other fans celebrated it for its subversion of gender and sexual norms. Some gay male fans, for instance, such as comics writer and cultural critic Anthony Oliveira, saw in Batman Damned #1 a way to rebel against the superhero fan culture's historical homophobia. In a tweet that garnered over 4,000 likes, Oliveira wrote, "Just called my local comic shop to reserve a copy of the book with his penis, and he muttered under his breath, 'This is ridiculous, and I am so glad I get to annoy a straight person and see Bruce Wayne's peener in the same day.'" DC's response to the controversy, however, suggests their closer affiliation with the comic book store owner. In an interview with Polygon that appeared on October 8th, so a week later, DC co-president Jim Lee, who provided cover art for Batman Damned #1, blamed the penis scene on production errors. DC's other co-president, Dan DiDio, was blunter, saying, "It's something we wish never happened." Digital editions and subsequent reprintings of Batman Damned #1 have censored Batman's penis by cloaking it in shadow. In some ways, however, this absence has enhanced the Bat penis's presence. The decision to censor the original comic immediately made it a collector's item. A year after the release of Batman Damned #1, signed mint copies were selling for as much as $1,700 US. Ironically, the same CGC certified plastic case that guarantees this comic's mintness ensures it can never be read. Thus, the visible penis that makes this comic collectible will remain invisible. I regard much of my work in general and on superhero sexuality in particular as a form of visibility activism. By that I mean I'm trying to make visible gazes, desires, and possibilities that have always been there, but have been historically sidelined, censored, or simply ignored by the largest and loudest creators, fandoms, critics, and scholars. But what does it mean to make the pleasure and power of supersex visible? Does it mean showing superheroes naked in erotically charged situations or actually having sex on panel? It certainly can. Making sexuality manifest can be especially important for those sexualities that have been the most historically sidelined. And I've given you some examples here of some indie superhero comics work. At the left there is a Canadian artist, Patrick Fillion, who has sort of a whole universe of queer superheroes. If you're a misogynist or homophobe, you should be worried about supersex. Because even when superhero bodies in mainstream contexts would seem to deny diverse gazes, they really don't. Take this image of Prince Namor and the Submariner. This image originally appeared in Marvel Swimsuit #4, published in 1994, and was penciled by future Marvel Comics editor-in-chief and current chief creative, his title now is current executive vice president and creative director of Marvel Entertainment, Joe Quesada. If you're not aware, the Marvel Swimsuit special is exactly what it sounds like, a collection of pinups of superheroes striking sexy poses in bathing suits. There were a lot of these specials in the 90s and early 2000s. They were part of the collector boom and bust of this period of American comic book publishing. What's notable about the Marvel specials is that unlike their rivals in Wildstorm, Top Cow, and others, they feature nearly equal numbers of male and female pinups. In Quesada's pinup of Namor, the Undersea King's ultra-exaggerated and excessively detailed musculature clearly evokes power more than traditional ideals of beauty, and specifically, a very elemental form of male power. Namor's almost painful-looking hardness, which is anointed with glowing rivulets of water rendered sticky and vein-like by Quesada's aestheticization of their journey over and through dramatic contours and crevices of flesh, is not simply phallic, but literally penis-like, while exceeding, as superheroes are wont to do, a mere human's biological limitations. Namor's penis-like body remains hard despite dripping with evidence of a voluminous eruption. Yet the degree and type of this body's excesses also tests the boundaries of the heroic ideal. Whereas patriarchal masculinity typically tries to stay invisible by passing itself off as normal and universal, the excessiveness of Namor's performance of masculinity openly invites interrogation and even, given the flayed appearance of the Undersea King's exaggerated musculature, dissection. You cannot appreciate this body without studying it, without following the sticky rivulets on their improbable, endless journey. In my previous work on stylistic excess in 1990s superhero comics, as typified by the different yet broadly similar styles of superstar artists Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and Rob Liefeld, I linked the especially pronounced exaggeration of this era's male superbodies to the anabolic steroid-influenced development of what Adam Locks calls the post-classical era of bodybuilding. Post-classical bodybuilding, Locks argues, is, quote, based upon the increasingly fragmented body, with overdeveloped body parts often celebrated and displayed over the whole. Post-classical bodybuilding's investment in freakishness is acceptable and desirable to the extent that it advertises the willpower and independence, and thus the primal masculinity, of the men who participate in it. Quesada's pinup of Namor similarly advertises the powerful independence of its creator, namely the post-classical comic book artist who has, I'm quoting myself here, rebelled against his commodification by exaggerating and twisting the ideals of his chosen genre to the point of carnivalization, which in turn makes those conventions at least partly his own. Yet the erotic context of Quesada's pinup reveals an even deeper intimacy between the superhero, the artist, and the reader. According to Neil Richardson, the post-classical bodybuilder rejects the increased commodification of the male body and male sexuality by, quote, building a body which is outside the regime of sexual allure. These bodies, Richardson argues, reflect, quote, fantasies in which men create their bodies to impress other men and disgust women. The caption accompanying Quesada's pinup of Namor could reflect this ideology in as much as it suggests that Namor is rebelling against his sexual objectification. Could the submariner's ferocity reflect some humiliation at having to don such a skimpy little number? Yet Namor is easily Marvel's least prudish male superhero. Since his creation by Bill Everett in 1939, Namor's primary costume has consisted solely of a pair of scaly green briefs, and since his reintroduction in 1962, his identity has been indelibly sexual. Namor is a constant threat to both invade the surface world and disrupt the Fantastic Four's nuclear family through his desire for Sue Storm and her clear desire for him. Moreover, whatever rebellion Namor is waging against objectification only introduces more erotic possibilities. Transforming Namor's limbs into supplementary penises does not desexualize him so much as ultrasexualize him. In a sense, Quesada's pinup does not close Namor off, but rather opens him up, maximizing both his virility and erotic possibility by transforming every bit of flesh into a potential erogenous zone. Precisely through its simultaneously desexualized and ultrasexualized excess, this image suggests what can be most radical about the superbody in its comic book form. In this image, the inseparability of Namor's power from his sexuality and of his phallocentrism from an almost anti-phallic sexual polymorphousness cannot help but create currents of erotic affiliation between the artist, the superhero, and the reader that must, regardless of the gender or sexual orientation of any of those real or imaginary persons, be regarded as queer. Reading Quesada's pinup of Namor requires poring over the water that pours over the muscles that were poured over by the ink that poured over the pencils that first devised the pouring water out of love for the superhero and in the hope of being loved by the reader. This pinup is a dream of self-sufficiency that cannot resist plenitude, seducing the reader with a dream of sharing an experience of spending private time, indulging the desire to spend private time, making a superhero your own. One vein and muscle and drip of water at a time. Despite all of this, it's important not to overstate the subversiveness of supersex. If we apply the same logic I used for this Namor image to most images of female superheroes, different conclusions tend to prevail. Take this image of the X-Men Storm, penciled by Jim Lee from the first Marvel swimsuit special. This image makes no effort to deny the male gaze and in fact smooths and commodifies the subversive contradictions that have at various times informed this powerful character. Unlike the version of Storm who led the X-Men in a punk aesthetic costume inspired by a romantic interlude with a female Japanese Ronin, Lee's pinup leans heavily into unironic exoticism. No signs of civilization interrupt Lee's depiction of Storm soaring through a savage land mountain range accompanied by a fleet of dinosaurs while clothed in a bikini seemingly improvised out of basic white cloth, her wrists heavy with gold bangles and leather twine while necklaces made of teeth dangle from her neck, waist, and ankle. In this pinup, Storm isn't contrasted with the primitive exotic setting, but rather compared to it and even integrated into it, her raised arms and tucked leg mirroring the posture of the pterodactyl flying behind her. To the extent that white supremacist culture has historically denied Black women even the sliver of power that comes from being considered objectifiable, Storm's presentation here could be considered tentatively progressive. Yet Lee's pinup denies what Deborah Elizabeth Whaley calls Storm's metamorphosis throughout the 1980s into, quote, a visionary social subject who propels social change, in favor of regression to the stereotype of Black women as, quote, embellished African gems extracted from imagined cultural contexts and artfully reshaped for commodification in the global marketplace, allowing readers the opportunity to gaze and graze upon Africa. What would it look like for a female superhero to be visible in a sexual context as a subject rather than an object? It might look like a scene I'm going to show you from Alias #1 by Brian Michael Bendis and Michael Gaydos, originally released in 2001. Alias stars superhero turned private investigator Jessica Jones, a character some of you may be familiar from the Netflix show, even if you've never read this comic. This comic is interesting for a variety of reasons, as the first appearance of Jessica Jones and as the first title in Marvel's own mature reader's imprint called Max, and you can see the sexual implications there. Max Comics, you know you want it. This comic uses this expanded creative freedom to swear a lot. The first word of the comic, which is the page in the middle there, is fuck. It also features on-panel sex in the form of this scene involving Jessica and fellow superpowered human Luke Cage. Except that in this scene, the sex is both visible and invisible, while using the superhero genre in comic book form special facility for navigating that contradiction to great effect. This scene is provocative on multiple levels. First, because the implication of on-panel penetration makes it the most graphic sex scene that had ever appeared in a Marvel comic up to this point. Second, because the sex is implied to be anal. And third, because it's interracial, and the US is where racial politics are concerned, especially in 2001. Despite this provocativeness, the scene does not traditionally objectify either Luke or Jessica. While Luke's size and strength are emphasized by within the sex scene's aftermath, his body is not visible during the scene itself, while the only visible part of Jessica's body is her face, which is uncomfortably close and decidedly unbeautiful. During the implied penetration scene, Jessica's heavily lined and shadowed face distorts and grimaces in a mixture of determination, pain, and, perhaps, pleasure. In addition, fully half of the page that makes up the implied penetration scene denies access to both Jessica's body and her face. Although this scene's copious presentation of Jessica's thoughts allows substantial access to her feelings and motivations, these denials of her face ultimately limit that access. This technique evokes Hilary Schute's argument that comics are particularly suited to staging self-reflexive commentaries on women's status as both looking and looked at subjects. Comics' ability to review the world can, quote, productively point to the female subject as both an object of looking and a creator of looking in sight. Though Shute is discussing autobiographical texts by female creators, which is an important distinction, her insights could potentially apply on some level to the depiction of Jessica in this scene. Despite being a fictional woman written and drawn by men, Jessica is imbued with the ability to manipulate the reader's access to her mind and body. Through her status as a private investigator and her possession of super strength, and through stylistic choices that expose her subjectivity yet protect her privacy, Jessica is literally and symbolically pictured as a woman who looks at the world and potentially back at the readers. This comic in this scene uses the monstrous desires of a monstrous woman to ruminate on the complexities of empowerment. I could literally talk about Supersex for days and days and days, and have been doing that a great deal of late, sort of a project I've been working on for most of my life. But as we're running out of time, and I want to make sure we have some time to have some discussion and questions, I'm going to wrap up with just a few general thoughts about what studying supersex in its comic book form especially can offer us. Demer Shamoun observes that to date, porn studies has focused nearly exclusively on, quote, real bodies producing real sex acts, and concentrated on the technological capabilities of film as the most appropriate medium for the pornographic imagination. This focus has been limiting, particularly as the multimodal and fragmented nature of comics, which communicate through sequential patterns and suggestive elliptical narration, has tremendous potential to complicate our understanding of the perceived and possible links and ruptures between sex, gender, sexuality, and desire. The dense locus of meaning that is the superbody can add to this value. The superbody and the supersexual contradictions it's prone to show that the monstrous desires comics so seductively communicate are mobilized in both independent and mainstream works, both literary-minded and generic productions. Supersex in its comic book form can shed new light on questions that have long troubled porn studies, sexuality studies, and gender studies, such as, does identification always follow gender, and does desire always align with sexual orientation? The depiction and censorship of sexual fantasies in American superhero comics suggests that society creates and consumes such fantasies not only or even primarily because of their frequently violent manifestation of what Judith Butler calls the impossible norms by which gender is compelled. There's strong evidence that people also consume these texts because of their potential to rewrite and redraw gender and sexual norms, a possibility with implications for many fields of study. Because comics and supersex are so intimate and subjective, it feels fitting to end my talk with a personal story about the ways supposedly silly images reflect and interact with complex social realities. For that, I'm going to go back to this image that we started with of Nightcrawler aping Burt Reynolds. The doll in this image is officially called a BAMF doll. You can see Nightcrawler refer to it as that in his caption. BAMF is the sound Nightcrawler makes when he teleports, when he imagines himself somewhere else and goes there, instantly if not quite effortlessly. A fabulous metaphor for escapism if ever there was one. The BAMF doll in this scene isn't the only one. Various dolls show up from time to time in Marvel Comics as a kind of running in-joke. There's never been a canon explanation of where they come from. They're just there, a piece of this comic book world. In our world, the non-comic book world, these dolls come from definite but diverse places. Marvel has never sold them, but fans have been making their own for decades and selling them and gifting them to each other. I have one, made by a female friend I met through a fan forum and through writing and sharing erotic fan fiction about Nightcrawler, our mutual crush. When the doll arrived, I slept with it for a week. Not so much because it made me feel close to Nightcrawler, but because it made me feel close to my friend, who lived a continent away and who I'd never met in person. My friend and I both identify as basically straight. We were married to men, and it was crushing on an imaginary monster boy that brought us together. But to paraphrase Miss America Chavez speaking to Kate Bishop, the female version of Hawkeye in Young Avengers number 15, no one's that straight. Mutant romance tales are never singular things. Like comics, they don't tell their stories in straight lines. Instead, they catch us up in sticky webs that they weave between objects and bodies, between heroes and villains, between aliens and robots, and humans, witches, demons, gods, and sentient beasts. These webs can catch us or free us, depending on our willingness to be caught. But they always seduce us, whether we realize it or not. That's all I've got, other than to do a couple of plugs for publishing things related to this talk. The main one would be my anthology coming out December 15th, Supersex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero, and various other things. If you look me up on academia or whatever, you'll find a list of all of these things, some of which were referenced in this talk. I'm going to stop sharing and give us some time to do questions or whatever, because I am very curious to see whether you had thoughts on any of that. So thank you guys so much.
There you go. Thanks so much, Anna. That was really wonderful. So many great images. Just like that. Yeah, no, we have some time for questions. So does anyone want to ask Anna anything?
Be brave.
Got a raised hand. Reina, yes.
Oh, so many questions, and thank you. That was absolutely marvelous. And I now want to go back and be 15 again and reading these comics for the first time, because I remember a lot of those images very well. Thank you so much. I was really struck by a couple of things. I really want you to say some more about those Marvel swimsuit editions. I think they're fascinating for the way they bring together those kind of threads you were talking about, you know, kind of soft porn magazines and things that were happening in that period that were around bodybuilding. There's so much in there. One of the things that I was really struck by was how much it looks like fantasy, like sci-fi and fantasy art from book covers and things like that from the same period. So if you would like to say any more about those swimsuit issues, I would love to hear it, please.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a fair amount of work on the swimsuit specials. I mean, I'll definitely I have a piece specifically about the swimsuit specials in the Routledge Companion to Gender and Sexuality in Comic Book Studies, which just came out in August. So yeah, some of that discussion from Namor was taken from that piece. But yeah, I mean, the swimsuit specials interact with a lot of interesting things that were sort of going on in that culture at that time. Definitely that linkage between fantasy art is an important one. I mean, that was, you know, there's so much cross-pollination between that and superhero comics, obviously. I mean, again, the thing that really I keep coming back to with the Marvel swimsuit specials and why they're so interesting is that the fact that they include male and female pinups, which is not true of any of the other specials. Also, the fact that there's a little bit of a different quality to them because some of the other specials by Wildstorm and Top Cow and these other publishers largely associated with the Image Group were sort of newly created characters. It would be characters that were like a few years old at most when those specials came out. Whereas the Marvel ones, you have sort of iconic characters being presented as newly erotic, at least in an overt sense. Captain America in particular is presented in many, many interesting and heavily queer-coded contexts in the Marvel swimsuit special. Whereas other characters, it's interesting, sort of, I've been talking about sexy monsters, and one of the swimsuit specials is actually called Big Fun on Monster Island, and yet a number of the monstrous characters have their sexuality kind of minimized in the specials, which is interesting. So I'm very fascinated about which bodies are sort of highlighted in the specials and which aren't. There's a lot of interesting but problematic sort of racial contexts of those specials as well. Which characters get featured in the specials is very interesting. They are even more dominatedly white than the superhero comics being published at that time, which is interesting. And those characters that do get featured, I think the ethnic and racial diversity of the swimsuit specials is like 90% located in the two characters of Storm and Psylocke. And Psylocke is a very problematic character because if you don't know, she is a white British woman who takes on the body of a Japanese warrior. So that's not really a great example of representation. But yeah, I mean, I could speak about the swimsuit specials literally all day, but I do think that they're sort of, as silly as they are, they're this really important demonstration of the superhero genre being aware of sort of the subversive sexuality of its own stories and its willingness to kind of play with that and court that, and even court queer gazes and to court female gazes to a certain extent as well. Although many of the images of men in the swimsuit special, I would argue, are not super accessible. They are often very similar to that Namor image. They're very aggressive. They seem to be denying the gaze, even as they don't really deny the gaze. But at the same time, the letters in the swimsuit special are 50% men, 50% women, and they're just these like thirsty letters about superheroes. So, I mean, to the extent that we keep denying those types of gazes, it's clear that the producers of these stories were aware of these gazes and at least had some consciousness of that it would make sense to try to appeal to those gazes. So I think there's so much with those specials that we could talk about, and I hope to do actually some more work on them moving forward.
Thank you so much. That's so wonderful. And one of the things that's so interesting about them is the way they take the superheroes out of their normal narratives in really overt sort of ways. I think they're fascinating. So thank you so much for that.
And that full sort of fall into fantasy too. We have characters sort of being romantic in those specials that they're not necessarily that elsewhere.
Yeah. Sorry, I will let other people talk now, but thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, anyone else? I have a bit of a follow-up question then. Like, what does it mean when, because I was struck by these swimsuit issue drawings also, and the way that desire gets so complicated and scrambled and queered and sort of appeals to this like broad spectrum of desires. But I mean, it strikes me that is possible because it exists outside of any normal context, right? So you put Storm in this like weird sort of prehistoric, surrounded by dinosaurs flying around type landscape. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about like the sort of, well, removing them from any context and whether that's sort of a strategy of maintaining that idea of separateness from the, I guess, normal context.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that separateness can do a lot of different things, and it almost depends on because I mean, one of the things about the swimsuit specials, I mean, I showed some sort of more typical sort of 90s art examples, but the art styles are actually very diverse, especially in the first couple of specials. I mean, it's just all different styles. So the meanings that sort of attend to any individual image can vary a great deal. But I mean, I would say it works especially differently for female superheroes versus male superheroes. As I sort of argued with Storm, I think removing her from that narrative context, which informs a lot of the power associated with her always highly sexualized representation, and yet that sexualized representation can mean different things depending on what she's doing in a story, how she's positioned in that story. Whereas when she doesn't have that context anymore, she becomes more of a traditional pinup, which again, negates some of the power that she has in other contexts. Whereas if we're talking about male superheroes, sort of they have their sort of objectification, which, I mean, so when we're objectifying or eroticizing male bodies, it always means differently because of the resistances to that in our culture, which are linked to misogyny and patriarchy and all of these things. So when we're objectifying those bodies at all, there's an element of subversiveness to it. So when you're removing the male superheroes from that context and sort of having an image like that image of Namor, where it's like the point of the image is to look at it and to look at it as long as you want and as long as possible. You can also do that obviously in a comic book. I mean, the fact that these are fragmented images mean we control the pace of reading, and that was one of the things that Wortham and other anti-comics crusaders were worried about. I mean, part of the subjective intimacy of comics is the fact that we have control over how we read them, right? The Marvel swimsuit special, by like getting rid of most narrative context, there's kind of a loose narrative to the situations. But I would say it's more disruptive in general for male characters than for female characters. The female characters sort of lose some of their subversive power in general by having the narrative context stripped away, whereas with the male, it's like this full embrace of like, yeah, the point of this name or image is that you're supposed to sit with it. You're supposed to intimately examine it. You're supposed to look at every single very, very detailed line of this and spend as much time with it as possible to appreciate the skill of the artistry involved. So like, again, I think that's sort of one of the through lines of like how some of those differences emerge. But I mean, again, that doesn't hold true of every image. That would just sort of say I would be like a general trend of like how that separateness functions. And yeah, but I mean, yeah, I don't know. Again, there's other stuff as well. I again would go back to, if you haven't checked out the swimsuit specials, I highly encourage you to look at some examples online, because the depiction of Captain America in particular, I think the subversive charge of him in those specials especially really benefits from its divorce from that sort of narrative reality. And if you look up some of the images, you will see what I mean.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Any other questions? Yeah, Daryl.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you'd kind of looked at any of the links kind of between the superhero characters and then the normal characters that are in their lives. Because if you in the way that they're depicted, because if you look at like something like Spider-Man and Mary Jane, in that kind of relationship, Mary Jane is often the one that's kind of hypersexualized as opposed to Spider-Man. And I just wondered if you'd actually looked at that kind of comparison with different characters.
I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, I was trying to kind of focus on some of the like less conventional or sort of like underexplored gazes in superhero genre, but I mean, obviously that like stereotypical, split between, subjects and objects that we definitely see in, especially something like the 90s, 80s and 90s artwork in Spider-Man comics, the late 80s and early 90s artwork of Spider-Man comics, in which you see sort of increased gender dimorphism between something like Spider-Man and Mary Jane in the hands of an artist like Todd McFarlane, who hypersexualizes Mary Jane to an impossible degree. But yeah, I mean, I'm specifically interested in kind of, because I mean, if we talk about the disruptiveness of contradictions, sort of normal human characters generally have less access to those disruptive contradictions than superpowered characters do. At least when we're talking about superpowered women, they always have that element of their strength kind of being at war with their beauty, which is the usual contradiction that female superheroes embody, or beauty or sexuality. Those things usually go hand in hand. So yeah, it's a bit trickier when you're talking about the human characters that don't necessarily have access to those contradictions in the same way. So I mean, in terms of the ultra boring, misogynistic, typical representations, I mean, the female love interest characters often bear the brunt of that in sort of the most definite, most inescapable way. But that's maybe a boring answer to your question.
No, I was just trying to think of kind of like characters, because usually you get like with the male superheroes, they have kind of normal human partners, whereas the other way, the female superhero characters tend to have superpowered partners. I was just trying to think if I was wrong in that.
Oh yeah, I would have to I would have to do a survey of that, but I can think of plenty of counter examples of female superheroes who've had non-superpowered boyfriends. But I mean, there's certainly a long history of that as being presented and problematic. There's a great essay, I'll hide the Supersex book, about Supergirl's portrayals and some of the portrayals of her many, many failed romances with human men, especially in the 1960s and Silver Age context, and her power being linked to sexuality and her being an impossible object for human men because of that. And there is a desire to constantly pair her with Superman, who is her cousin, which is problematic and blah, blah, blah. But there's a desire to pair her with Superman to limit the disruptiveness of her power. And this gets played out sexually in many superhero stories. So that might be something you're interested in checking out.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent.
Frederick, Andrea had a question in the chat.
Oh, all right. Andrea is asking, do you want to ask the question, Andrea, or are you?
Yeah, I can ask.
Me reading your questions.
Probably easier. I was just wondering the extent to which like current Marvel runs, like especially with the X Factor and Leah Williams writing it, tends to embrace the queer community more explicitly, and then you see in perhaps other runs that are more geared towards a different kind of I don't know, audience kind of reject that. And I just wanted to know like the sort of weird cognitive dissonance that exists there, and if you have anything to say about that, and yeah, I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think that almost speaks to sort of like the good and bad of sort of those subjective intimacies, right? I mean, we can read all this queer coding into a comic book, and yet the comic book publisher, they own that story and they have the full power to walk that back, right? I mean, there's a lot of instability going on right now, like, you know, with the portrayal of sexualities in various Dawn of X titles. So that's the current X-Men continuity for those who don't know, and not knowing whether this reality is going to be permanent or not. And yeah, as you're saying, like sexualities are getting depicted differently in different books. I mean, it's like the good thing about that is that we can have this diversity and we can have different books appeal to different people and different gazes prioritized and different images and all of these things. And yet the danger of that, right, is that we can have those things walked back by sort of the next issue of a comic. We can have sort of these manifest sexualities always under threat of being rendered non-manifest again. And that's a real, real problem with kind of superhero publishing and sort of the shared continuity universe in general. When I've written about Jessica Jones in the past, I've talked about how sort of what was subversive in her portrayal in this original Alias series was significantly walked back when she was integrated into the main Marvel Comics universe. Without sort of the creative freedom of the Max imprint, she becomes a very different character. She becomes largely associated with her relationship with Luke Cage. She becomes largely framed as kind of a mother, and oftentimes is presented as a hysterical mother, especially during her pregnancy was a really sort of not great storyline for Jessica. And so yeah, that's definitely a concern, and that's definitely one of those things that I would highlight as being one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking through, you know, Supersex has this subversive charge, and yet what are the limits on sort of making that charge manifest? And some of those gestures that you're talking about, having sexuality is one way in one title and another way in another title, as much as it sort of, you know, lends itself to that subjectiveness can be not a great thing either, because yeah, it can be a way to just walk back those more subversive meanings as well.
Excellent, thank you so much. Any other questions for Anna? Miriam.
Hello. Ooh, can you see me?
There you are. Hi, Miriam.
Hello.
Oh, poor Miriam has seen a version of this talk before. I know, I apologize.
Oh, I was late today, so I'm sorry about that, but I have seen it before and I do know how good it is, so thank you for doing it again. I have more of a kind of methodological kind of question, because we're thinking a lot about analyzing subversive portrayals of sexuality. I'm wondering how you go about analyzing the normative, or do you analyze the normative, or how do we see the kind of the boring I don't want to call it boring, but like, you know, the heterosexual the heterosexual kind of normative sexualities, are they normative? Are they portrayed as boring, for example, or anything? Or is there anything you notice about, I don't know, maybe it's something that comes up in your book, perhaps, or your edited volume that you want to kind of elaborate on a bit more?
I mean, sure. I mean, one of the things, I mean, talking about these subversive qualities of mainstream text, you know, as I was saying, you know, it's always really hard because you don't want to sort of overemphasize that subversive charge because, you know, these things do have primary meanings, and usually the primary meaning is not the subversive meaning. But at the same time, I mean, what I still come back to as being really interesting about something like that name or image is that in the denial of the gaze, you have other gazes made, you know, possible, right? And that when we're talking about this medium and this genre, that sort of those subversive possibilities are always there, even in those moments of boringness. There's almost no way to completely shut them down. And that is interesting if we think about what people like about these texts, if we think about what fantasies are these texts sort of conveying, because you can get you can get porn, you can get sex, you can get eroticism in so many other places, and yet people are looking for those things in this genre in this particular way. And even if the eroticism or like depiction of sexuality that they're looking for is they really don't want Batman to have a penis or have sexuality at all, that in itself is fascinating, right? Because why do people want that from that character, and why are they so intimidated when we suggest he at least has the possibility for sexuality? And showing his penis doesn't even suggest that necessarily. I mean, it's just the level of hysteria there is really striking, right? And I mean, that's partly just, you know, our weird ideas about penises in general. But I mean, still, like, the group of people who don't want the genre to be sexual and are really sort of, you know, especially in terms of male characters, usually because, you know, patriarchal genre. But I mean, that in itself is interesting, right? So like people who like are just like, no, it was never sexual, it was never sexual, and are just really on that, like that in itself, it's like, yeah, that denial really needs to get talked about as well. So like, yeah, I don't know if that's like a good answer to your question or not, but definitely sort of, you know, being careful not to overemphasize sort of the positivity of this genre is something I really have in mind. I'm someone who most of my work has just been complaining about this genre, and I've been trying to kind of, you know, I don't want to say be more positive lately, but just sort of balance those things in my work for sure.
Oh yeah, I love the Banff doll. Thank you for reminding us of the Banff doll. That's a great answer. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Miriam. Any other questions? All right, well, maybe we'll end here then. Thank you so much, Anna. That was really wonderful. That was a great talk, and thanks for joining us for this comic studies research talk today. For everybody else, keep your eyes out for invitations for more talks to come, and hopefully see you there. But thank you so much, Anna, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all so much for being here. Have a good day.